Well, dear one, when I left school, I don't know, 3 years, 1 year in the city, doing odd jobs. And then 2 years teaching, student teacher, unqualified, not a qualified teacher. Just teaching what he knew to kids in maths and I suppose you could say sport, games. I knew very little about games, so I think we could almost ignore that bit. I was just, taking them out on the field and so on. With the maths, I was making maths enjoyable to kids. You could say I was professing the subject. I was telling them, showing them, so they could understand the subject to a certain level. And I could do it by being both strict, in control of the room, and fun. We had great fun. The kids were to enjoy the time together and look forward to the lesson. And, well, teaching was different in those days. Difficult children who would have caused havoc, we kept in check with fear. I mean, that's the fact of the matter. We kept law and order, because without law and order, well, the lesson won't hold together and you achieve nothing. And that's the truth of the matter. And some of the children there won't love you, no matter who you are. There'll always be some that don't love you. And in that sort of environment, in those days, you would keep order by force if necessary. That's not something that we find attractive, of course. Maybe expedient, but not attractive. These days we have abandoned law and order for subtle controls, but very often don't work, and we just have chaos and a teaching situation which is neither enjoyable nor worthwhile. And the kids are really growing up in a wildness, which means they will gravitate to whatever the immediate best option seems to be. Larking about, sleeping, doing something else on their machine, on their mobile phone, larking around. Some of them will do that, and some will be incredibly earnest, of course. And, well, schools are not good places, but that's because you're trying to mass-produce education instead of having a one-to-one relationship, which in some idealized way is what you do when you homeschool. And homeschooling is, well, streaks ahead of school schooling, if you know what I mean. Well, I've done that with my second son. Homeschooled him to about 10 and 11, 10 and a half. And well, it's very good. come back to where I started now. I really had the purpose in this recording of pointing out what is to profess. It's to give an understanding of the subject to another person, to profess the subject. That was my forte. And at university, I did it as a class teacher while I was doing advanced studies, as they think of it at university. And then, to help me with financing more advanced study, at some point I got a research position. So not as a professor, but research. But I was doing research and doing teaching at the same time. And registered for, further postgraduate studies. I was actually doing a PhD, which I didn't complete. Well, I got a long way down the line, but I found I didn't need to complete because I had a full-time research, and I, if you like, promoted to senior research officer. And then in other institutions I was employed as lecturer, which is really, well, interesting. Is there a difference between a lecturer and a professor? Yeah, well, a professor's a higher grade. But a lecturer will be lecturing many of the courses that you might have to be examined in, like the sort of undergraduate level and the postgraduate level of masters, and the honours of undergraduate grant and so on. Undergraduate qualification. So there's not much difference between a lecturer and a professor, except in some sense the professor is more experienced and, strangely enough, not necessarily better able to profess. He may just be, well, a more acceptable lecturer from a management and coordinating role. He has a bureaucratic position in the university that is not so much a professor, strangely enough, a teacher, in other words. Less of a teacher and more of a coordinating manager. The ones that run a department. In the same way as a senior research officer might have other research people under him. Research then is to sort through data, basically. The data might be a close analysis of the subject itself as at present understood. And it can be a sorting through of original data, more observation, in other words, of the world, and handling it in the way that is understood to be acceptable by the profession, by the subject specialists. And coming up with new ideas. research is something that extends the subject. A professor doesn't. In pure terms, a professor just manages. In particular, those that teach. Now, teaching and lecturing is not quite the same thing. I might be extremely uninspiring in lecturing and not teach at all well. I give the outline of the subject formally, but I could be a very bad teacher. And students find my lectures, say, very hard to follow and very tedious. So you wouldn't say such a person had a flair for teaching, but in a sense he might be quite a competent lecturer in that he covers all the material. I mean, he basically just reads it out, which reminds me of another skill at university, or if you like, type of person, type of employee, which is a reader. Now, a reader is forever mining different ideas related to the subject, not necessarily closely related even. He's reading and bringing in ideas from elsewhere, especially, or contrasting different views. He's a mine of information of the literature of the subject and wider related subjects. Quite a senior sort of post, not necessarily a good teacher, not necessarily even a competent lecturer. Certainly not a manager, like the professor tends to be, or the senior research officer. In fact, the reader is almost a sort of higher, deeper spiritual equivalent of the subject. He has his bearings and roots in a wider field, a wide view, not a narrow specialism within the subject, and close to what we might want to call a philosopher. But as I say, not necessarily a good teacher or manager or research worker in the mundane way that I've defined it, of collecting data and extending the subject. A reader is a sort of beholder of things, has a much broader overview, very creative in its way, well, amazingly so. In fact, those that love the subject actually become readers, mature in their subject, and they personify the subject at its most, well, I think the word is eclectic or spiritual level, a sort of commanding view. But very much a individual view according to their wide experience of study. The reader is in fact the epitome of the student. ever looking at related things to the subject wider, from different angles, getting a structural overview, sort of master of what the overall change of the subject is. What's the change of the subject that's happening through time. Very experienced, ideally very knowledgeable in that sense. Well, each has its place in the institution, along with management at the top of the structural pyramid, so to speak, of organisation. And everybody else, right down to, I say down to, the cleaners and the groundsmen and everything that's feeding into this organisation that makes it feasible, function, hold together, and so forth. So that makes up the university as a identified unit of socialisation in our society. Sort of elite part of society in some ways. What we call the academic field. Elite both in part of the management of a society and control of it and socialisation, and also elite within its structure of education. The basic elementary level being the schools and preschools and so on. And then, colleges, tech colleges, and up to your universities. Are there other ways of doing education? Well, there certainly are. But we don't recognise them in such as we might have done a few hundred years ago, where you simply worked with a specialist in his field who probably was self-funded or had a patron that funded him, and he'd be an expert in, say, physics or chemistry or even philosophy. And he was specialised in it. That was his job. He had one or two helpers, people that were close to him, apprenticed, if you like. It followed the apprenticeship approach rather than the mass-produced classroom approach. And the apprentice, the assistant, would a couple of other assistants in the place if he was really well off enough to fund it, That would be it. And when he died, well, they were the ones that knew more about the subject than anyone else, and they could well find that they were inherited the funds because they were the children of such people, or received or inherited it because that's what he wanted to finance in his will, or they might continue the patronage from the one who died and carry on that way. Which meant that sort of pinnacle of understanding of a subject was the prerogative of the rich, and who the rich chose to be such workers, experts, study of that subject that interested them. The rich typically being landed, of course, and perhaps royal too, in most societies. In some sense, then, you still had to please others if you were not rich in order to have the funds to, in some sense, your line of work was therefore dominated by what really interested your person that funded you. Unless you were self-rich, of course, in which case you were very free to do research the way you wanted. Whereas the modern system tends to capture both, if you like, rich kids and those that would have been funded into the modern system, which very much dominates where your research is to go. In other words, it has to be something that's acceptable to your profession, received especially by its journals, your research, and papers, or publisher, books, and the funding to do it is part of the structure of the organisation rather than your freedom. There's much freedom in it, but there's no point in finding a cure for cancer if medical profession don't want a cure. They want a profitable industrial process. So you could find you in a situation where you're actually handicapped by our modern system. I don't mean that you necessarily are, but you are constrained by what the system is, unquestionably. The question is how tight the constraints are on you. In that sense, freedom and private income or retirement is wonderful because you can use the time to just go down the avenue that you find most fascinating and interesting and rewarding in whatever sense you find reward. Well, if I apply this analysis, it's rather long, this has now gone on for more than 20 minutes. If I apply this analysis to what I do here in recording on YouTube, I delight in taking what I think is of value in my subject, which we'll loosely call spiritual development, shall we? Or help in living, help in the fullness of life, putting it in a form that relates to people, hopefully. So I use very everyday speech, and as far as I can, try to avoid religious jargon, or at least make it very clear what I mean by it if I do use it and the way I'm using it. Make it not too heavy, but very rewarding for the individual, very meaningful, very helpful, and that's paramount in my mind. I want my audience to be blessed. That's my driving. That's my driver. And a bit like Jesus says in my mind, I'm come that you might have life and have it more abundantly. Smoking flax he will not quench. In other words, he wants it to burst into a fire of success, fullness of life, life eternal, or you. So I'm free in an extremely charitable, ideal situation I find myself. It costs me nothing. YouTube is free. There are a few constraints, things you mustn't talk about. Well, yeah, I understand that. We're in a society, and the society is the way it is. But it costs me nothing to publish. And by the grace of the state and God, of course, I have state pension, which allows me not to worry about working at my great age, 78. And I can spend my days purpose to be a blessing. What could be a more fulfilling and happy and wonderful way of living? Fantastic opportunity, one that I've experienced through much of my life. Basically, I've been given grants, 6 years of undergraduate and postgraduate study. And employment that allowed me enormous opportunity to bless and help students, if you like, people generally as well. It's been an absolute gift of a lifetime. As I say, the occupation I would do, whether I'm paid or not, if I have the opportunity. In other words, if my needs have been met, I found my needs were just about met as a student. You could say barely. You could say barely now as a retired person. I mean, state income is not wealth, I can tell you. But of course, with wisdom, you can, live wisely within your budget and allow yourself incredible freedom to be a blessing to those around you. And we're sent. There's no question of that. That's what jon17's about, according to the story anyway, Jesus. We're sent to tell them what? God loves them. He's their heavenly dad. And that's the foundation of fullness of life and life eternal. And to somehow teach that, to deliver it to a wider audience that they may be blessed. Wow, nearly 30 minutes. I don't think I can break this into a shorter couple of shorter recordings. I think I'll leave it as it is. Thank you, Heavenly Dad. Oh, I think I should have mentioned more fully under old-fashioned systems, so to speak. The church was a great source of both learning and teaching, of course, to particular purpose, but allowed a freedom where you would get scientists that the church suddenly found was threatening their doctrine and so on, and they clamped down on it, but they were great seats of learning, weren't they? Again, with their constraints, a bit like society in the modern world, but if you tread carefully, you could find great opportunity, I think, within it. Yes. Well, that's just a note, isn't it? Thank you, Heavenly Dad.
Yes, although I was casual in speech in this recording and said teaching at times, when really I should have said professing, not teaching. What's it Jesus say? You call me teacher and so I am, but it's a very peculiar form of teacher. It's an inspiration, isn't it? And if you can't profess with inspiration, well, you're just another employee of the establishment, a bureaucrat, you know. Now, don't get me wrong, bureaucrats are invaluable if you have to have vast organisations like societies and so on, corporations and so forth. You just can't do without really competent bureaucrats. And I've had a few friends that were like that. And good souls too. But to profess, yes, I think I've defined what I mean by professing. And a term I'm happier about than teaching, and certainly better than lecturing or, loosely speaking, public speaking, you know. To profess is, in some sense, I think, to be one with your subject. And its propagation, yes. As I say, ideally to bless. Thank you, Heavenly Dad.